We're good.
All right, I've got the chat up as well. Good morning, everybody. Now I know what it feels like to be deaf a little bit, I guess this morning. All right, so let's see. Okay, let's see. Sorry. I know, let's see, I have to share my screen, don't I? Okay. Okay. We're good? You can see me okay? Okay. All right. Okay, well, good morning. I'm Heather Woodson. I work as Associate Vice President of Academics at Gaston College. And even though I've been through 3 strategic plans at different institutions, we just went through a strategic planning process at Gaston College this past academic year. So this is super fresh for me. And certainly, if you guys have questions, stop me. I'm going to try to share some details from our planning process as we're kind of going through, just to kind of illustrate some different things. But like I said, anytime you have questions or anything, just let me know. Hopefully I'll be able to see the chat come up. And anyway, so we'll just go ahead and get started. So one of the things that a strategic plan is used for is really to articulate your mission and vision, basically give it some life. It's really the plan that makes that mission and vision happen. Of course, you should be using it to prioritize your resource allocation on campus. So I know, like at Gaston College, whenever we're asking to purchase something or we are asking to add new employees, one of the things that we have to articulate is how that relates to our strategic plan. So I like that the institution has done a really good job in making sure that the purchases that we make, the resource allocation that we have, really does link back to our strategic plan. Dr. Jones, can you hear me okay? You're good? Okay, all right. So, of course, the strategic plan also gives your organization some focus. So it gives them, a plan to lead from. And of course, you can't forget about SACs or other accreditations. So, of course, your strategic plan does help you meet the standards for planning and assessment, because if you're using your strategic plan well, you're also evaluating how well you're actually meeting that strategic plan. So, kind of in summary, it gives you some direction and some accountability at your institution. So as I kind of mentioned, one of the kind of the foundations of the strategic plan is your college mission. And I've given you an example from Gaston College, and we actually redid our mission statement as a part of this most recent strategic planning process. And that's something that can happen if you realize that all the information that is coming to you through the strategic planning process really has kind of shifted the focus of the institution. Then you may need to go back and reword that mission statement. And I know, and I can tell you, rewording this mission statement was a painful process. Our old mission statement was very long. It was an entire paragraph. I'm not even sure anybody on campus could have cited it on the spot. And we'd had that mission statement for a very long time, but I really do like how through the strategic planning process, we were able to kind of recraft that mission statement and kind of refocus the college. So you can see what our new mission statement is. And in addition to that, we went through and made a new vision statement as well. So we really felt like in our service area, we wanted to be the college of first choice. So that was important to put in there. We've done a lot with trying to really ramp up the learning opportunities, particularly in active learning and apprenticeship, co-ops, a lot of different ways we were doing that. So we really wanted to have something in that vision statement about exceptional learning opportunities that empower students to meet their goals and have that lifelong success. So I think you'll see elements of both the mission and the vision in our strategic plan when I kind of show you some examples from our strategic plan. So again, this mission and this vision that you have really back up the strategic plan, but the strategic plan brings that mission and vision to life for everybody. It gives you specific goals that you're trying to meet. So in that strategic plan, you are going to have goals and objectives. And again, just pulled a couple since we just recently went through this process. I wanted to show you a few of our goals. So we have a strategic direction, number one there. You can see it's a commitment to student success and completion. And the strategic goal here, we're going to identify and scale best practices to increase the number of students who complete. Now that can be courses, certificates, degrees, programs. So this is basically what we intend to do. So you saw with like our mission and vision, of course, we wanted to increase the success of students through these learning opportunities. But specifically, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to see what things are being used well at other institutions, what things are showing up in the research that really are best practices that we want to use at the college, because we want to make sure that students are completing, whether it's their goal is to complete a specific course, a certificate, a degree, or a program. And then you can see with strategic direction number two, we are trying to work with our business and community partners to identify opportunities for academic and career pathways, and actually either add services, modify services. Sometimes you might have to stop services as well if that service is not really being a service to the community anymore. I'll give you an example here. We are now looking at the potential of a second early college high school that meets the needs of the service area. Caramont Health, which is a major healthcare provider in the community, needs additional graduates. So we're looking at adding additional services at the college to help meet that need. So I'll stop here, see if anybody has any questions right now.
Good.
You're good? Okay. All right, great. All right. Okay, so the implementation plan is something a little bit different. It has a lot more, we'll say a lot more going on. So your strategic plan is, of course, that guiding directional plan, and it's usually forward facing. So, you know, it's something you're going to have on your website. You might have it on your literature that you have for your college, that things that you're passing out maybe in the business community. But your implementation plan has a lot more meat to it. So it's traditionally not a public facing document because it's going to, it may change a little bit as things in your community or things in your institution change. It identifies resources that you might need to accomplish the goals that you've set. It may and often has, here's who's responsible for that to make sure that it happens. That person is obviously not doing it all by themselves, but at the end of the day, they're the one who's ultimately responsible for that specific goal. It normally includes completion dates and some assessment criteria. How do you know you actually met that specific goal? So I'll give you, these are just a couple of snippets from our implementation plan, and it doesn't include all that. It would have been a little too busy, but just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how that might look different than that public facing strategic plan. So you can see that we've got, again, our strategic goal here under strategic direction number 1, but you can see some specific strategies that the college wants to use. So for that one strategic goal, we've got 11 different strategies we are going to use to actually get there. And you can see that we've got some key performance indicators that are identified. So this is the assessment piece of that. So you can see that some of the KPIs we're looking at are both fall to spring retention as well as that year to year or fall to fall retention. We want to know how many students are graduating, both at that 3-year benchmark as well as a 6-year benchmark. And that can both be, we look at 2 things. One is, did they complete an associate's degree, or it could be a diploma or certificate. And what does that 6-year baccalaureate graduation rate look like as well? So we track both of these things. We're looking at our students that are coming in, how many of them completed 12 hours during that first academic year. And then, of course, the percentage of students that are moving from adult high school or some adult equivalency programs into our curriculum programs. And I will say, this is where I feel like we spent a couple of months really crafting this implementation plan after our strategic plan was pretty much already set. So in our most recent plan, we started meeting in September. We had 9 open forums over the fall and the very early spring. We had a draft to our college's executive council in early February. And kind of the rest of the time was spent really in crafting this implementation plan. Now that we've got these strategic goals, you know, how are we going to get there? What things are we going to look like? And I think it was really important for us to choose key performance indicators that were not creating a lot of extra work for those of us having to be responsible for the different pieces. So these are things that we are already looking at anyway. So we don't have to worry about doing some extra assessment just related to the strategic plan. These are things we're looking at all the time due to the other things that we're doing at the institution. So, so I think it's important, I guess, not to burden yourself with extra work related to the strategic plan. This should be part of what you're doing anyway. So this isn't something extra. This is part of what you're doing. This is part of, you know, maybe not every person at the institution, but certainly the leadership at the institution should be looking at these things and should be sharing the results of these KPIs with everybody on campus. So, does anybody have any questions at that point? We're good? Okay. All right. Okay, so what is that planning process? So if you look at kind of what's in the literature and what happens at most colleges, that planning committee is traditionally 10 to 12 people. However, I will tell you that we had 35 people on our planning team. I see Dr. Jones shaking her head like, what? First of all, just getting 35 people together who could actually be there at one time in a meeting is like pretty impressive. So we had our meeting date set at the very beginning of the year to try to make sure that everybody could be there. I do understand the reasoning behind such a large committee because we do have 3 campuses. We have lots of different service areas. And so they wanted to make sure that everybody from across the college had a voice because we knew this particular planning process was going to be very robust. When we had gone through strategic planning last time, we did have a much smaller committee because we were really pretty happy with where we were and pretty happy with where our strategic plan was at the time and really felt like we wanted to continue along the same lines. And so We didn't really make a lot of changes last time, but this time we had made enough changes as an institution. We really felt like this was going to be a major overhaul, and it was. So that's why we ended up having 35 people, including 2 of our Board of Trustees members. We did have members, of course, of our executive leadership team on the committee. One of those folks, the director of our foundation, actually led the strategic planning process. So she was the leader of that very large committee, and we had one other member of the executive staff. And our president would come in for meetings as she could, but wasn't there all the time. And I think part of that was to make sure that everybody felt comfortable in the sharing of information. So, we didn't have all the executive staff involved, but certainly some were always there. Of course, we had tons of staff, faculty, students. We did have representation from our Student Government Association. They appointed 2 students to serve as a part of that. As I mentioned, we had 2 Board of Trustees members. And depending on what colleges choose, you may have some sort of external planning specialist or consultant. This most recent time we did, and it's actually the first time I've actually been a part of a strategic plan where it was somebody from the outside actually leading the process. And it was a much different experience, I think in a good way, because they could ask some of the hard questions that folks who work for the institution may not feel comfortable asking. So for us, I'm super happy that we actually used an external consultant, and they did kind of push us a little bit and ask us some questions that were sometimes uncomfortable. So I think, it doesn't always have to be, we used Polly and Associates. It doesn't always have to be some external planning consultants, but maybe just somebody who's external to the institution, who has been through the process, who's knowledgeable of the process, who can kind of ask those tough questions. So, excuse me. As I mentioned, our strategic plan went from September all the way to May, and that's pretty traditional that you are going to work on the development of the plan over the course of an academic year. So that is not atypical at all. Of course, you're looking for opportunities to gather information from everybody on campus and the community. So we had, as I mentioned, 3 different open forums on each of our 3 campuses. We had online forums as well for folks who couldn't come in person. We gathered information from our community partners, from our advisory committee. So we did a lot to gather information from the multiple stakeholders that are present on campus and in our community. We also did a lot of looking at seeing what was going on outside the institution, kind of what's happening in other community colleges, in our case, what's going on in the region, in the state, what's going on in education. We looked at a lot of different reports, and I kind of went back and looked just to kind of be able to share some of the different things we looked at. We looked at our student satisfaction surveys, both a national and a local survey that we give. We looked at our operational planning documents at the department level. We looked at our state performance measures. We looked at national benchmarking results, enrollment trends, financial statements, usage numbers for all of our different service areas, every student metric you can imagine. And so we looked at a lot of information during this process. And one of the things that our Pauline and Associates, the folks who led our process, looked at too was in the community college world, there is a prize called the Aspen Prize. And it basically means that you were kind of, you're really on top with regards to what student metrics we're doing. You have a lot of completions. Your students have very good persistence. So they actually brought in documentation from some of the different Aspen Prize winners to see what they were doing, because we said, we want to be this college of choice, and we, want to make sure students complete. So they brought in information from really award winners across the nation to be a part of that, what we were diving into as well. And so we did a heck of a SWOT analysis. And we swatted until we couldn't swat anymore, I think. And like I said, spent months doing that. And I really appreciate that this is something that they did, and something we've done in the past as well, is that trying to get us to figure out what our competitive advantage is. What is it that we do that's unique at Gaston College that we can, really kind of hang our hat on, and make sure that that is woven into the strategic plan. So, of course, we mentioned the Board of Trustees, of course, has to be involved in the process. We had 2 Board of Trustees members, as I've mentioned, but at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to approve this planning process. So they were given updates on the planning process twice during the development, just to kind of see where we were, even though we had 2 Board of Trustees members that were there, pretty much for every meeting. We did have them reviewing it along the way, and of course the final approval. But at the end of the day, they're really holding the president accountable for making sure that that strategic plan and all the goals in the strategic plan are met. And any decisions they make, of course, you hope that they're using that strategic plan to say, okay, well, which way do we need to go on this? What does our strategic plan say? How would that lead us? So they're involved in the planning process. They're involved in the execution of the plan, and they're involved in making sure that the plan is achieved. So how do you show success? I've showed you some of our KPIs that we were using, and they included both quantitative and qualitative measures. So just a couple of examples, retention rate, our iPads graduation rate, student satisfaction surveys. So basically there's lots of different things you can use, and that's going to be variable per institution. So depending on the type of institution you are, what type of data you have access to. But at the end of the day, your planning committee has to make sure to figure out how you're going to show that you've actually gotten where you said you wanted to go, because that's all of that closing the loop. It's nice to have this plan, but you don't want it to be just something that hangs pretty on the wall and you never use it and you never show that you actually got there. So you've got to make sure that for this assessment and planning process that is required of you for lots of different reasons, you want to make sure you're assessing it well, again, in a way that's not cumbersome. It's a part of what you're doing at the institution. It shouldn't be extra. It should be a part of what you're doing as an institution. So, of course, you have your plan. We've mentioned you have an implementation plan, but it should be trickling down into the other plans that you have on campus. So for us, we have division level plans that are called unit plans. They're something that we do yearly, and we have goals for our different departments and divisions that really hook back into that organizational strategic plan. We link our resource allocation back to the plan, our facilities master plan, our enrollment management task force, and the plans that they come up with the budgeting process. So you've got all these different plans across campus to do things, and they should all be aligning to that strategic plan. If they're not, there's some sort of disconnect there. So you need to make sure that all your different plans that are kind of across the college are all lining up with that strategic plan, because this is what brings it to life. And as I mentioned, it shouldn't just be something that hangs on the wall or something that sits in a book somewhere. What you're doing on an everyday basis should be bringing that strategic plan to life at your institution. So one of the things that we have each year are what's called the President's Priorities. And from across the college, we have to report on how these President's Priorities are being met. And these all directly link back to our strategic plan. So these are the President's priorities from last year, just as kind of an example. So these would have aligned with our past strategic plan, but you can kind of see some of the different things that and how they might relate back strategic plan. So again, they have a little more meat to them. They're a little more specific than the statements that you have in your general strategic plan. And I know this is going to be hard to read, but I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how we use our, we call them unit plans. So you can see kind of in the middle of the column, there's at the very top, there's linkage to unit goal to institutional mission, goals in support of the mission, the reason for the goals, who it's assigned to, and relationship to strategic plan. So when we have specific things we're saying we're going to do as a unit, as a department, as a academic division, we are having to link this to our strategic plan. And so you can see that for this particular item number 13, as an example, that we're going to work with personnel in our student affairs area to serve students in the transfer advising center. That related back to our strategic goal number 2, 4. So, you know, so there's that goal underneath your strategic mission. So you can see that we are using it in our everyday operations within the different functional units at the college. And just to provide another example, you can see that this is a budget request form, and this one's, you know, a couple years old. It doesn't matter, but you can see right in the middle of the page it has related college initiative, related college goals. So again, this is referring back to our strategic plan. So what is it you need? How does this affix to our strategic plan? And this it's not visible on this part of the page, but below that it basically has an assessment piece as well. So we are really using this plan and the assessment of the plan across the college in our everyday dealing. So hopefully this gives you kind of some illustration of how at least our college is bringing that plan to life every day in what we do. There's of course a lot of articles out there about strategic planning. This is one of my favorites because it really kind of, I guess, calls out institutions who go through a strategic planning process. And one of the things that happens during the strategic planning process is that, you know, a lot of institutions do what they call blue skying it. You know, in a perfect world with all the resources we need, what would that strategic plan look like? And it's great to do those types of exercises, but at the end of the day, you have to make sure that your strategic plan is achievable. You know, you have an assessment piece to this. You know, it might be nice to say, yes, in a perfect world, we would have 100% graduation and every student would have a personal mentor to help them get through, et cetera, et cetera. For most institutions, that's not realistic. You have to have, you know, this cost benefit analysis, a realistic financial plan to make sure that your strategic plan isn't too lofty for what you can potentially achieve at an institution. So in other words, you know, dreaming big does not help if you don't have the physical or personal resources to actually achieve it. So your strategic plan should be the words that I love are ambitious yet achievable. So it should be, pushing you forward, but not setting you up to not be able to achieve your plan. So again, this is kind of one of my favorite articles for that reason. Kind of some other gems from that particular article. It may fail if you're trying to please everybody and put in so much in strategic plan to make sure, so as an example, if every one of our 35 people on the committee representing their different service areas from across the college had added a strategic goal, then there's no way we could ever achieve that. You can't focus on pleasing everybody. You've really got to focus in on a number that are coming up through your strategic planning process as being the most important, the things that are coming up over and over and over again, not things that are kind of that one-off. So you've got to be strategic in what you put on your plan. So, and then of course you want to make sure that you have enough time, but not too much time, in when you do this planning process again and change your plan. So, I know ours is every 5 years. That's kind of at the limit of what's considered to be okay, and it's pretty standard. But 10 years might be too long. As you guys know from being in this program, things change. Things change pretty rapidly. New types of instructional methods come about. Different things, lessons are learned by institutions trying different things. So you may not want to wait 10 years to do it. So, 3 to 5 is probably in that more acceptable range. And successful models have these common characteristics to their strategic plan. So they're inspired by a presidential vision, but developed in consultation with that campus community and the board of trustees. The planning process itself was very data informed. As I mentioned, we used probably 25 different documents and sources of data from across the campus, both quantitative and qualitative, to figure out where we were and where then we wanted to go from there. We're trying to those strategic plans that are the best are trying to have that good balance between being that blue sky, so a little aspirational, and realistically what we can achieve. So as I mentioned, a minute ago, kind of that perfect balance is ambitious yet achievable. And, you of course want to include some of the new approaches to education at the institution. So as an example, something that we're doing a lot more of is, the open educational resources. So if you're doing something new, you want to make sure that that's a part of what your strategic plan is. Okay. And colleges should understand their competitors, as I mentioned a minute ago, understanding how you're different from your competitors. What is your competitive advantage? Of course, you want to make sure to include that. Most of them focus on 4 to 6 goals. So again, not trying to please everybody and have dozens of different goals. As an example, ours has 5. You want to have shared governance in the process. We had 35 people in that shared governance in the process, but at the end of the day, the president, the board of trustees, the executive leadership, at the end of the day, are responsible for the decision making, because they're the ones that are going to be ultimately responsible for the assessment piece and making sure that it actually got done. They're going to have to answer to the board of trustees to say, did we meet it? How far did we get? So at the end of the day, it's really executive leadership that's responsible, even though you should have a lot of shared governance in the process. So this I thought was a good graphic to kind of show you kind of what that planning process is looking like. So you can see that, you've got your planning cycle beginning. Again, all those pieces there of looking at your mission, vision, doing that environmental scan and your SWOTs, and developing the goals and objectives, and the implementation plan is happening over the course of an academic year. Of course, you should be having some sort of annual review of, what happened, what has happened in this past year, what are our assessments of results saying, looking at that every year, again, not kind of hanging it on a shelf, but actually looking to see each year, how did we do? And then, of course, you got to start planning for the new plan. So it's a constant loop of continuous improvement of where are we, where do we want to be, are we where we said we wanted to be, and what do we need to do the next time? So this is kind of that 5-year cycle, or however long your planning process is at your institution, kind of what that looks like, in kind of a very concise way. So some final tips for the process. Dividing the roles and responsibilities of each of the members there. We talked about having a sufficient number of people to be able to lead the process. In our case, we have 35, but 10 to 12 is usually a little more normal and manageable. Of course, communicate the need for changes. What data is pointing us to the fact that we need to make some changes in our strategic plan. You want to listen to historical perspectives and people who've been at the institution a while, but at the same time, you don't want to be bogged down by doing it the same way you've always done it. So there has to be a balance between history and moving forward. And of course, be as inclusive as possible when you're speaking with your stakeholders. You certainly don't want to make anybody feel like their voice is not valued in the process. This is a quote that I just loved, that really talks about, I really think it points to bringing that strategic plan to life. And it's when President Kennedy was visiting a NASA facility, he asked a janitor, "What is your job here?" And the janitor replied, "I'm here to put a man on the moon." So even though your different folks at the institution may have different roles and different responsibilities for things that they are doing at the college, at the end of the day, they should know that what the goal is, what are those things on the strategic plan saying, and that their job is a part of that, and that no matter what they do, even if they're cleaning toilets and sweeping the floor, it all goes back to that same strategic plan. Okay. So maybe y'all might have some questions now.
Anybody have any questions? Now say that again.
Recommendation for
how to display recommendations on how to display or communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how to display or communicate their strategic plan? That's the question. Okay. So for us, we had we have college-wide meetings several times a year. Traditionally, at the beginning of the fall semester, beginning of the spring semester, we also have a college-wide meeting at the end of the spring semester, just to kind of wrap everything up. So we actually presented our new strategic plan at the very end of our last academic year, because it had been through kind of the whole process. It had been blessed by everybody it needed to be blessed by. And so we were ready there at our very late April meeting to kind of announce that strategic plan to everybody. But we do also use those convocation events at the beginning of the semesters to kind of remind everybody of what that is. It's also displayed very prominently on our website. We also have copies of it in many of the different divisional offices. So it's something that, for example, I used to be the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and a copy of the mission, vision, and goals actually, and the strategic plan actually was hanging in my office when you came in the office. So they actually printed several copies of that and had them in literally dozens of different places on campus, just as kind of a daily reminder of what it is we're doing, what goals we're trying to meet. So, but I certainly, and as I mentioned earlier, having it really embedded in those annual processes. If I'm making a purchase, I'm having to look back at the strategic plan because I have to say how it links back. If I'm asking for resources to be allocated, how does that link back to strategic plan? If I had those unit plans that I'm, working on each year and reporting back on, again, those link back to the strategic plan. So I think Gaston College has done a particularly good job at linking it really across the institution, not just displaying it on the wall in a pretty frame, but actually utilizing it day to day. And I think that's probably the most important, is not just, is it on our website, is it in a pretty frame on a wall in the president's office or the dean's office or wherever, but how is it in my daily life that I'm actually seeing the strategic plan?
Any other questions?
Answered the two that I had.
What were they?
The length of the plan, it was kind of towards the end, you took the 5-year plan. And then, I guess the other question I had was, so she talked about the implementation plan being not publicly facing, so that's like internal. Is that why kind of the percentages and the quantitative stuff was left out of this? You know what I mean? Like a lot of the KPIs were like enrollment or number of completing these courses, but it didn't have numbers.
Okay, so how would I phrase that question?
Had some of that information
Does the internal plan have more of the objectives in the
Right. So like all of the KPIs were increase or maintain, but what's the base? Where are we starting from? Where do we want to get?
Percentages or more specific measurement
of
your goals.
Those KPIs.
Goals or KPIs. Does that make sense?
I think so.
The internal document have percentages. Right?
Yes. So in other words, like for retention, do we have a specific goal stated? Is that what you're right? Yes. Yeah. So the internal document, yes, it does have kind of where we are. And so the one I showed you was just kind of some basic snippets that we kind of shared with the institution as a whole. Now we do have a much more detailed internal document as well that kind of shows where we are and where we want to be for each of those KPIs. So it has like, our most current fall to fall retention rate as an example, and shows actually how much we want to make improvements in those particular items. So yeah, it does. The actual full implementation plan is very lengthy for that reason. And again, it has people's names next to it, who's going to be tracking this, who's going to be responsible for that. So yes, it does have specific targets on it. So yeah, that's a great question. So, and it should, again, those, you want to be aspirational yet achievable. So that was part of what takes at least the implementation plan development so difficult, is having to come agreement to what those KPIs should get to. as a part of that process. So, and again, that kind of puts that accountability back to everybody involved. So it's nice to say you want to improve retention as an example, but by how much and what strategies are you going to use to get there? So good question.
Can you ask her, like, what's an example or who's an example of who's on their strategic planning process? So she gave the quote about Kennedy and the janitor, but do you have people who are in lower level positions or are, because they have 3 campuses, was it like representatives from each campus? Do you have the head of custodial staff, like, or is it just the VP and the president, the exec board, when you talk about steering a strategic plan? Like, where does that make sense?
Yeah.
When we think about involvement at all the different levels, do they really pull from
And
all
it
the
has
levels?
students on there too.
Yeah.
But it didn't say what staff, it just said staff.
They, funny. Yeah, they. 4. Was the janitor on there? Was someone?
Or some,
Because higher level should make sure the people that are actually
Or people from the front lines, or staff from the front lines involved?
Oh yeah, yeah. So we did have a very diverse group on the planning committee. So each of the different service areas had basically the ability to appoint who they wanted to appoint for those different areas. So we did. It was probably about, just kind of remembering back to the different people, it's probably about a 50-50 of more of the, we'll say, leadership versus frontline staff. So, we had, as an example, a librarian on there. We had somebody who was a groundskeeper on there. So we have, kind of a mix. And again, the goal there is to, you want to kind of have that happy medium of, and I really like too that through that process, we also, a lot of the feedback that we gave during the process was anonymous. We were writing things on sticky notes and, they were being collected afterwards, or we were putting them on a wall and then walking out, so that, that sometimes when you have leadership involved in your committees, it can be hard to voice what you really want to say. And so, we wanted to make sure, I think that the planning folks did a really good job at, being able to collect the information from both leadership and that frontline staff. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we had open forums for the whole campus, 9 of those. So anybody who wanted to go, so we had 3 on each campus, and we had an online forum as well to share information. And all that information went back to our folks that were leading the process from Polly and Associates. So there wasn't anything that was being returned directly to leadership at the college, so that the frontline staff could not feel comfortable in sharing their voice. So I think, again, for me, this was the first time we'd had somebody external leading the process. Well, I've been there, and I know Dr. Jones used to be at Gaston College as well. And so you might have had somebody, before, leading the process. But since I'd been there, it had only been an internal leadership. But I kind of liked it the way they did it this time, and they had such a good mix of folks and really spent a lot of time gathering everybody's info from across campus. So I think, it is important to have that balance of what are the leadership saying versus what are frontline staff saying about the changes that you need to make or the progress you've made in the past and kind of where you are. These are great questions.
Could you ask if there was any lack of participation from a certain area or department, and how did they engage those people or departments or
If so, how
how did they
did
engage
you engage?
or attempt to engage?
I don't know the answer to that question because it was being led by an external group. I'm not sure, so I actually don't know the answer. I think it's possible for knowing who had responded. I think that would be easier to track, but at least, and I was involved in a lot of the higher level discussions as we kind of moved along due to my job at the college. And I don't remember ever hearing that was a problem, but maybe it was, and I'm just not aware of it. But because we did have an external, group kind of leading that, I'm just not aware if that happened or not. I would say if I were actually leading the process and we noticed that there was some lack of participation from a department, that might be a time for kind of a sit down meeting with that group to say, hey, we noticed you haven't, been chiming in as much on the strategic plan, or are there things that you want to share? We want to make sure your input is heard as we move forward. As an example, I know that we have one particular department on campus who tends to be, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it. They don't engage as much in the process, but they are very vocal about the outcomes in general of anything on campus, not just strategic planning. So I know that, as an example, we're leading another major initiative on campus right now called Guided Pathways. And I have had sit-down meetings with that particular department on 6 or 7 different occasions to kind of make sure that all their questions are answered, that I'm hearing all their feedback, that I'm assisting them through the process. So I think it's important to put some energy into making sure that areas feel included. So, I think that if it were me leading the process, I would take a similar approach for that reason. And that seems to be the approach that's been working for this particular department, is to, make sure that maybe they don't feel comfortable sharing what they want to share in that more visible environment. So I would think, directly engaging them, if you see that, would be, and just say, hey, we want your input. What do you have to say? I think would be important.
She kind of, she's really done a great job of answering one of my other questions about the consulting group and how they really took the lead as kind of being a guide. I'm curious what kind of investment that was for the college.
Do you know what the my follow-up would be, was it worth it?
Right.
I definitely think it was worth it. It was, I don't remember the exact amount, but I will say it was in excess of $20,000 to have an external consultant. So it was definitely, I never did hear the exact final number. Sometimes you just better not to know, So for me, it was completely worth it. And I'm sure that price varies. They came to campus a lot, so I'm sure that price varies a lot by what, you kind of get what you pay for. So maybe if they're spending less time on campus, it might be more affordable or whatnot. Because certainly if you're a smaller institution, you may not be able to pay as much for the process. So I'm sure there was probably some maybe a la carte ish type options as well. For us, I definitely think it was worth it. I think just in them really trying to push us to think, and sharing some outside perspective and asking questions that it's hard to ask when you're actually employed by the institution. So I think it doesn't necessarily need to be an outside planning firm, but certainly, a consultant might be a better way to go. But again, having somebody who's been through the process, who's experienced in the process, who is not afraid to ask those tough questions because they do not have any institutional loyalty to your college. So I really think for us, it was worth it. It was what we needed at the time. So I think you really have to decide are you happy with where you are? Are you kind of almost recycling an old plan? Or are you really ready for change? And if you are, I think that external consultant is definitely worth the money you pay for it.
Any other questions or comments? Anything you'd like to say? Need to type.
And you're okay. I was like, you were frozen there for a second.
Sorry.
Great. Okay. Well, I appreciate you having me this morning and kind of giving you some examples of our strategic planning process that we've had. And y'all asked some great questions this morning. So I'm sure you're going to continue to be engaged with Dr. Jones the rest of the day and ask a lot more great questions about whatever she's got on tap for you the rest of the day. So anyway, y'all have a good Saturday.